The Portuguese set sail for never-before-seen waters in search of Christians and spices, experiencing the adventures of the discoveries. Portuguese expansion began in Africa. It continued with the finding of the Atlantic islands, and then, from these footholds, the development of the Indian and Brazilian routes. Each hardship was a lesson for the next stage, and the Portuguese came to be masters of the oceans, from the Indian to the Atlantic. It was quite a journey indeed, and the sheer thrill of adventure and the pursuit of wealth alone warranted such an undertaking. However, have you ever wondered what life, hygiene, food, and sexuality were like for those who crewed these ships? Well, everyday life in Portugal was harsh for humble people, but it was nothing like the dramas experienced aboard the ships. But navigation was essential, and reaching India was the easiest way to bring in money. The vessels most used to sail to the Indias were the naus, as they were bigger, stronger, and had a higher load capacity. During these trips, they were overcrowded, with 900 crew members. The average room per person was around 50 square centimeters, and never more than twice that. There was very little space for people to move around. Most of the ship was taken up by the crown leather, while the sailors rested in the holds, shared in shifts. The hold included the cater, which was a kind of hanging bunk made of wood, divided into 3 or 4 floors, serving as a berth for the crew. As we can see, they had little or no privacy. The living conditions were also unhealthy. The holds were cramped, hot, and humid. On the return trip, when the ship was loaded with cargo, the sailors were crammed together. Children, who served as apprentices and formed most of the crew, often slept out in the open, exposed to the scorching sun, piercing winds, and pouring rain. The common plebs did not have much better facilities. They were allowed nothing more than a trunk in the hold and a sleeping place. The social status of the sailors also shaped the level of discomfort on the ship. The allocation of room on board was far from democratic. The ship's captain was given his own cabin, with a 2-meter-long balcony at the tail of the ship. The pilot and the masters all shared the same compartment, so that they could watch the Mazina, the sail on the aft mast, which ensured stability and allowed the ship to turn right or left. As the ships were cramped, food and supplies were always a problem during sea voyages. On the outward journey, the shortage of food in Portugal prevented the ships from taking on enough to feed the crew. The journey to India took an average of 1 year, and the supply stops were limited. As a result of hunger, the trip was a permanent struggle for survival. This contributed to the high mortality rate on board. When traveling to Brazil, the crew suffered less, as Salvador was reachable in up to 2 months from Lisbon, and the number of crew members was smaller. The vessel most often used on this journey was the caravel, a smaller, lighter, and faster craft than the ship. Goods shipped were often of very poor quality. They would frequently deteriorate before the journey even began, or end up rotting right at the start of the journey because of the humidity in the holds where they were stored. Red meat, dried or salted fish, broad beans, lentils, onions, vinegar, lard, olive oil, olives, wheat flour, oranges, cookies, sugar, honey, raisins, plums, canned goods, marmalade, cheese, and rice were among the most shipped products. Rice was more prevalent on the return journeys, since it was an Asian product introduced to Brazil by the Portuguese. There was no shortage of wine and water barrels to drink from, but after a few weeks, the wine would turn into vinegar, and the water would be filled with maggots. To provide fresh food, animals such as chicken, oxen, pigs, sheep, and goats were brought on board. These added to the filth on the ships, as they often pooped and peed, making the whole place even more unhealthy. Not only did the food have a terrible state of preservation, but access to it was uneven. The ship's captain oversaw allocating it. There was a black market inside the ships, as the captain and the men close to him got hold of the best products. Whoever could afford it would go ahead and buy it. Those who were unable to pay ate rotten cookies, munched by rats and cockroaches. The uneven food distribution led to tension on board, often resulting in insubordination and mutinies. But the allure of profit appeared to be greater than the risk of insubordination. As soon as the voyage began, Each crew member was given a parcel of sugar, honey, raisins, plums, flour, and other canned goods. Anything left over was kept for the sick, but it ended up on the black market as the journey went on. The lack of wind was terrifying, making food scarcer. To escape hunger, people brought with them a private food supply, which was never enough for the actual needs of the journey. The vitamin-poor diet explained the widespread diseases on the ships. The main one was scurvy, called gum disease then, brought on by a lack of vitamin C. It caused swollen gums and tooth loss, swelling, and leg pain. The period for the symptoms to appear varied from person to person, depending on their nutritional condition when they were taken on board. Oranges carried to circumvent the problem were only accessible to those who could afford them on the black market. The absence of basic hygiene standards worsened the havoc wreaked by the abhorrent living conditions. It was not common, for example, to wash used spoons, bowls, and plates. Moreover, these items were shared by a large number of sailors and passengers. The sailors' worst nightmare was the quiet times under the blazing equatorial heat, when hunger and thirst would take hold of minds delirious with exhaustion, as people would eat anything. Shoe soles, paper from letters, or leather torn from trunks. Dead and putrefying animals and even human corpses were considered treats. Even seawater and urine could no longer be skipped. Oddly enough, those who ate rats got rid of scurvy, since rats synthesize vitamin C from the food they eat. Water was stored in wooden barrels. It was used in poor hygienic conditions, so it soon got contaminated by microorganisms, causing serious illnesses. Many ships lost most of their crew due to the lack of water. Without water and privacy, body hygiene and changing clothes were impossible, martyring everyone on board. These unsanitary conditions were the real source of the parasites, even though it was believed at the time that the human body formed lice from contact with damp floors and sweat. Some ships had such a large number of lice that they claimed victims. There were no toilets on board. The poorest would lean over the side of the ship, facing the sea. Some would fall. They would disappear, never to be seen again. Whoever was able to make use of potties, whose fetid contents were then flushed away by the servants in whichever corner. To alleviate the odors, agua de flor, a sort of cheap perfume, was handed out to everyone. Aromatic herbs were also burnt as incense to make living together a little better. A ship seldom arrived at its destination without at least half of the crew being sick. Dysentery was one of the most common illnesses, caused by poor hygiene and improper food handling. There was no cure at the time. It killed by dehydrating the malnourished. Several other diseases could plague the crew, and very little could be done to help the sick. In this troubled context filled with deprivation, sexuality on board the ships was seen as taboo, and at the same time, paradoxically, with a degree of freedom that was almost unheard of in the kingdom. Sexuality on the high seas was almost libertine. Sexual activity on ships was almost always a collective practice, with no permanent partners and the sharing of sexual objects. Sexual practices considered promiscuous for today's time ran wild on the ships. If there were no women on board, teenagers ended up serving the sailors sexually. The Inquisition took homosexuality for granted on the high seas, justifying it by the lack of women. Women being scarce on the ships led most of the sailors to indulge their sexual desires with other men. These relationships often involved rape. There was also a hierarchical relationship. The wealthier men compelled the humbler ones to satisfy the wishes of the higher-ups. When someone was raped on board, especially a teenager, they hardly ever reported it, either out of fear or shame. In short, the law and morals of the strongest prevailed. Some sailors also often took prostitutes on board, and they were often deceived or forced. The presence of prostitutes on the ships often helped to calm the men's tempers. Aware of this, some captains opted to make these illegal women pay for their passage with sex work. The ratio on board was 1 woman for every 50 men. Women were not forbidden to board, but some family leaders took their wives and daughters with them as they sought to earn a living in the New World or in India. Women's only protection from constant sexual harassment was their high social status or young age. The coveting of women's bodies did not spare even the religious women on board. Wives escorted by their husbands were not protected either. Rape was usually committed not by single individuals but by groups of men, making it very difficult to identify those responsible. The assurance of impunity was the rule, which perpetuated the practice. When the raping became rampant, some captains banned women from being on board. This video shows what life was like on board a Portuguese ship during the Great Navigations. Desperation for a better life, greed for wealth, or the simple desire to venture out into the world made men and some women face this challenge.